Today on History's Tech, we are looking at the next in our series of looking at the different classifications of tanks, and we are looking at the heavy tank. Now, when we're discussing the heavy tank, the common view of a heavy tank is that it's generally a tank with heavier armor and typically heavier armaments that sacrifices mobility and maneuverability for better protection and firepower. And while this viewpoint is essentially true, as you see through the progression and the evolution of the heavy tank, that by the time they are discontinued, they no longer sacrifice mobility and maneuverability and instead try to create an all around package that will lead into the next evolution of tanks. But let's go ahead and look at the heavy tank. Now, when we look at the origins of the heavy tank, we of course have to look at World War I and the early developments of tanks. And early tanks were essentially armored tractor platforms, usually designed to move troops. They were light, typically had a modest speed. However, what really changed the need for a heavier tank is the usage of trench warfare in World War I and no man's land. So, of course, when we're referring to no man's land, we're referring to that territory between the Allied and Central Powers trenches that was basically a dead zone that nobody would cross. And so you needed an armored vehicle that could not only go over trenches, but since it was an incredibly fast vehicle due to the conditions of no man's land, it could take a pounding. And so the idea was these heavier and heavier tanks that had better armor to protect those inside and support infantry. So, what we would technically consider to be a heavy tank was born. Of course, the British will be the first to develop what we will consider a heavy tank with their Mark I tank. Of course, the French, who were known for the effort they put into their light tanks, the Renault, ended up developing their own heavy tank to deal with no man's land, known as the Char 2C, which was actually the most technologically and complex tank of its day, and it was really complex that it couldn't even be produced to participate in World War I. It actually kind of had its service life after World War I. Now, the Germans only built one tank during World War I, and it was a heavy tank. That's the A7V, also known as the Sturmpanzerwagen. But they were very well known for capturing Allied tanks and reusing them for their own purposes. Now, as we get to the close of the war, we start seeing modifications and improvements. The Mark 8 tank, also known as the Liberty tank, is going to be the last generation of the British Mark tanks. And it is this complete package in terms of a World War I heavy tank. And this tank will actually take the French, United States, and British into the interwar period. Now, each of these nations is going to go their own direction during the interwar period. The British will develop one more heavy tank, the Vickers A1E1 Independent, but this is essentially a prototype tank, and they end up abandoning it in favor of the development of cruiser tanks and infantry tanks instead. The French will continue the development of the Char 2C and create the Char B1, which originally started off as a self-propelled gun and then took on its own life as what they referred to as a battle tank. The Soviet Union will get involved in their own development of heavy tanks, creating what's known as the T-35, which was a rather unique tank in that it had 5 turrets, 3 of them had cannons, 2 of them with machine guns, creating a rather unique concept of a multifaceted multi-gun tank. Now, to improve upon the issues that the T-35 had, the KV series of heavy tanks were developed by the Soviet Union. And the KV would actually have a rather interesting career. While it actually initially only served until the end of World War II, its chassis and platform would be used for dozens and dozens of variations on this tank. Now, the United States didn't begin its heavy tank development until about 1939, when it really looked like things were going to start heating up in Europe, and they may need to possibly be prepared for future tank combat. Now, the design had its issues, and there were some budget constraints, and only 40 of these tanks were ever built. Now, continuing with this development of tanks before the United States entrance into World War II, we have the joint U.S.-British tank, the T-14 heavy tank. However, this tank was basically overcomplicated, it had a lot of development issues, and it wouldn't even be fielded until 1944, when it would be essentially abandoned after 2 were developed. Now, arguably the most famous and probably infamous heavy tank of World War II is going to be that of the Tiger. And the Tigers actually represented a change in the heavy tank. No more were we concerned about maneuverability sacrifices and speed sacrifices. Instead, now you had a tank that was a heavy tank, heavy armor, heavy arms, and actually did have speed, with them reaching speeds of up to 30 miles per hour. However, the Tiger was a victim of its own engineering. It was way over engineered. The materials were too expensive, very labor intensive to build it, so they were incredibly unreliable tanks. Now, because of the success of the Tiger tank, we start seeing the development of more tanks. The Soviets will develop their IS series of tanks. These tanks were designed after the Soviet Union captured a Tiger in 1943, and they were designed as a breakthrough tank, being that they were designed to go in with heavy explosives, destroy enemy entrenchments, bunker positions, things like that, and push the lines forward. Not only did the Soviet Union develop a series of heavy tanks, the United States followed. The United States developed the M26 Pershing, which was supposed to be a replacement for the M4 Sherman. And at the time it was developed, it was seen as a heavy tank. However, by the time we get into the Cold War, it'll be reclassified as a medium tank. Now, one of the last heavy tanks to be developed at the end of World War II is going to be the French ARL 44. However, it was very limited, it wasn't seen as satisfactory, and it ended up being phased out after only 60 tanks were produced. Now, just like our light and medium tanks, the story comes to an end for the heavy tank during the Cold War, but we actually see this huge surge at the start of the Cold War for more heavy tanks. The Soviet Union during the Cold War begins to really ramp up production of their IS tanks and modernize and improve them. And so we see in direct response to that, countries like the British, French, and the United States all developing their own heavy tanks to basically build a counterpoint to the IS series of tanks. And as the Americans develop their M103 Heavy and the British their FV214 Conqueror, we start to see an interesting problem occur with the development of heavy tanks. We start to see essentially an arms race being developed for who can build the biggest, heaviest tank. And we start to reach a problem. As these tanks are getting larger, their guns are getting larger, we start to approach the maximum caliber a tank crew can handle. And we start needing two-part ammunition like seen on a battleship. And so this is going to reduce the rate of fire, better wear on the barrels. Eventually, the tanks no longer have mobility or maneuverability again, and we're basically creating just a large field artillery piece. And it's at this point we see the next evolution in tank warfare. The British will develop their Centurion tank, which is going to be this package known as the Universal Tank. And it's going to combine speed, maneuverability, arms, firepower as necessary with armament to create this total package so you don't need a light, medium, or heavy tank anymore. You have one singular tank. And of course, that's going to give birth to the main battle tank. And with the development of the main battle tank, there is no longer a need for the heavy tank. The light tank, the heavy tank, the medium tank are all going to be replaced with a singular package. So no longer militaries need multiple tanks doing different jobs. They have a singular classification of tank. But there you have it, a quick look at the heavy tank, its origins, its evolution, how it went from basically being a way of protecting troops across no man's land during First World War to evolving into this mainstay of heavy tanks that we see because of the development of the Tiger and then becoming part of an arms race in the Cold War before it's eventually phased out in favor of a far superior platform, the main battle tank. And while you could look at the main battle tank as the current version of a heavy tank, it's got too many qualities of the medium tank in it to really say that it's one particular category of tank evolved into the main battle tank, and different elements were taken from different series of tanks to create the main battle tank. But that's it for today. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you on the next time.